Right, yes, we colluded and agreed that I was going to go next, so the next discussant. I'd just like to start by thanking Leah for setting up this conference today. It's a really interesting subject and one that's of great importance increasingly, particularly as we see the growth of digital markets and, in this case, of course, of the role of peer-to-peer markets. We've already heard a little bit about some of the benefits of digital markets, the significant benefits that they've brought to the economy. We've heard about improved service, greater choice, more information, better price discovery and better quality. And just to take a UK perspective for a moment, we can see that e-commerce is having a massive effect. It's e-commerce is already accounting for about, I think, more than 13% of retailing online is happening online in the UK now, and the average household in the UK is going to be spending something in the order of £2,000 online in any given year, and that's increasing year on year by more than 13%. The CMA, our mission is to make markets work well for consumers and for firms, and we bring this perspective to the digital markets as well. We've recently conducted 2 calls for information that look at the way in which digital markets work. And I want to try and draw out some of the implications from that work and think about the application to peer-to-peer markets. And I'll be echoing some of the themes that we've already heard this morning. I have to say, though, that peer-to-peer markets are fascinating, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have had some time to think about these markets. They're relatively new to me, other than as a consumer, but they do have some really interesting properties. They have the potential to unlock underutilised resources in the economy, and they have people, me, others included, are trading with one another and potentially competing with very established incumbent firms. And creating completely new marketplaces. As part of the research that I did, I came across a site that is trading internships. So you can offer up an internship for your relative child, and you can trade those so that you can have better matching, better opportunities. That's a completely new marketplace that never existed before. Now, their aim is to try and break down some of the old boy network. I think there may be some questions about whether they're actually going to achieve that, but nonetheless, it's a really interesting development and an interesting business model. So I think it's an important one for us to look at. So the two main areas that I want to pick up on are the role of consumer data in peer-to-peer markets. So we've recently conducted a call for information which is looking at the use of consumer data and particularly understanding whether there are any consumer protection issues that we should be concerned about, and how we can make sure that this sort of fundamental cornerstone that facilitates peer-to-peer markets is actually going to work and continue to function in future. Peer-to-peer marketplaces really do rely on our data for their existence, and there are some interesting questions here for us, I think, both as regulators but also as economists, in thinking about how that market for data is working in itself. The second area is also echoing an earlier theme, which is the observation around the trust mechanisms, the reliability and design of that's central to making these markets work. So my second observation is really just about the strategies these marketplaces use to try and mitigate some of the frictions that can arise from the information asymmetries, sometimes on both sides of the market, sometimes on one. So in a nutshell, how can Uber convince me that as a rider I'm safe getting into the car of a complete stranger? And that obviously creates some challenges that we've already heard a little bit about. Obviously customer feedback, so the ex-post reputation mechanism is crucial to this. But what evidence is there that the consumers view feedback as reliable? How do they approach that feedback? Is it trustworthy? And what problems are there, and how might we think about overcoming those? There's some growing literature that looks at the design of these trust mechanisms and has some really interesting insights about what might be effective measures of quality. There's a whole realm of economics that's developing just to look at how we can improve the design of these mechanisms, and it raises some very interesting questions. And so I'll just conclude with a few questions of my own, so very much from my own perspective, things that have occurred to me in thinking about some of these topics. And they're obviously focusing a lot on the issues around consumer protection, also regulation, competition enforcement. How can we make sure that the benefits that are brought about by the kind of disruptive innovation that these markets bring continue to flourish and grow? And obviously there's a role for regulators in ensuring that happens. Right. So let me start with some observations on how peer-to-peer marketplaces work. And I put this in there because some of this was new to me. So I started thinking about how these markets use consumer data, and many of you will know far more than I do about this, and it's going to be the subject of a lot of the discussions later on in the sessions. But I was somewhat staggered to know that eBay holds some 10 petabytes of raw data. Now, I try to visualise that, but I couldn't. I imagine it fills rooms and rooms and rooms of servers. So they have 10 petabytes of data, and that's consumer data, essentially, from the searches that we perform. And it uses this data in all sorts of very interesting ways. So it's using it to gauge the performance of its own site, to try and detect fraud, to try and increase the likelihood of a match, because essentially it's performing a matching function. eBay is optimizing its search engine results by making changes, so small changes to the ranking of search results based on analysis of these 10 petabytes of consumer behavior patterns. So the search engine then becomes more intuitive, and this increases the likelihood of a match. There was a really interesting example that I saw that was looking at how eBay had done some research which looked at the likelihood of the match happening, and that would be being greatly increased for particular types of products if there were slight changes in the actual search terms that we used. So there's a German lamp that's called, I think, a Peltz lamp, all one word. But the likelihood of a match and the likelihood of the seller achieving a good price is actually greatly increased if those words are separated. So the search results are actually changed in order to improve that match. So rather than having one word, which is what the buyer is typing in, it's then reported as a split word so that you get a better match there. So that's just one way in which eBay is using consumer data, but Airbnb and Uber are using it as well. So Airbnb is obviously functions as a matching function between drivers and riders, and it has what it calls a machine learning model that learns hosts' preferences for accommodation requests based on their past behaviour. Sorry, Airbnb is obviously not riders and drivers, it's hosts and guests. And so Airbnb is using this data essentially so that for each search query it's trying to think about, it tries to estimate the likelihood that relevant hosts will want to accommodate that guest. So it's used these machine learning models in order to try and improve the matching, and it's shown some evidence that the booking conversion has increased by more than 3% by just using the learnings, the insights from consumer behaviour and the analysis of that data. They've said that really the data is the lifeblood of their business, and they're using it on both sides of the business, even down to thinking about the effectiveness of the photographs that hosts are posting online, and testing how that can be improved in order to bring about better matches in the market. Uber has described itself also as a data business, and the reason for their success is really they manage to get riders and drivers to the right place at the right time, and in order to do that they need to know where we are, so they need to know where the riders are and the drivers are. So as a consumer I need to be prepared to give up my data, my locational data that tells Uber where I am at any given point in time. So consumer data is really fundamental to the functioning of this market, and you can see how it's essential that we as consumers are prepared to give up this data and trust the firms that use them. So this brings me on to then the commercial use of consumer data, which is the call for information that we recently completed, really just to understand how the market for data is working and whether there are any issues, either in terms of consumer protection or competition, that we should be thinking about as a competition authority. And it came about from some observations and some concerns that had been expressed publicly about the consumer's ability to control this data, worries that people are essentially unaware that they're giving up very valuable and important information without really knowing how it's being used, and concerns that are starting to arise around whether this data might be giving rise to the ability to exercise market power. So what did we find? Well, we found that there are many benefits, all the ones that we've already talked about. So there are lots of benefits from better search and better matches, and on the supply side, it really means that we've got the data can facilitate increased competition, which means we've got higher quality and lower prices. We see that entry is easier because there's access to large and targeted audiences, so the barriers to entry for firms can be lower, which obviously facilitates improvements for all involved. And then when we looked at the way in which data is being used, it seems as though things are working pretty well. We can see that data is flowing around, people are sharing their data, so there's reason to believe that things are working quite well. But there were a couple of signs that led us to think that maybe consumer sentiment towards data sharing is perhaps a little fragile. Firstly, there does seem to be low awareness of the scale and extent of data use. So it's not many consumers are aware of how firms are using their data and how it's being collected. And there is an underlying mistrust of organisations that collect data. So the Royal Statistical Body has done some work looking at trust in organisations, and it's particularly low for those who are collecting our data. And something like 30% of consumers, we found, have major concerns about privacy and don't want to share their data at all. Now, that's quite a large chunk of the consumer population, and I think if it were to grow, then it would obviously call into question some of the ways in which these markets function. And there are clearly some weaknesses in the mechanisms that allow consumers to make choices about their data, how their data is used. So the privacy protection and the terms and conditions are complex and long. I know that I'm not very good at looking at those terms and conditions myself, and it's difficult to opt out, so it's difficult to actually decide that you don't want to hand over your data. So it's not always easy for consumers to exercise control over their own information. And so there's a risk that consumers may start to mistrust the data that these firms are collecting and that they fundamentally rely on, and that would obviously have a massive impact on peer-to-peer markets. Now, there may also be some competition risks. I mean, obviously, this is peer-to-peer markets are a very early stage, but when we're thinking more broadly about the market for consumer data, there may be some concerns that where data is, particularly as an important element, as an input into the competitive process, proposition, that there may be risks of the exercise of market power. And possibly firms may be able to use sort of exclusive access to data to raise rivals' costs or otherwise disadvantage rivals, and we might be concerned about that if it raises the prospect of preventing entry or expansion, where there are few substitutes for that valuable data. And clearly, the extent to which we're concerned about any of these issues is going to depend very much on the characteristics of the market in question, and it's going to vary from one case to the next. But these are some of the issues that we think might be under scrutiny in the coming years. So my second observation is also echoing the point that we heard earlier, which is really around these trust mechanisms and the ways in which peer-to-peer marketplaces use feedback in order to ensure that customers trust them and that both sides of the market are functioning properly and that they can attract buyers and sellers and make those work. So in traditional marketplaces, we can pick up and test the product that we want to buy. I can go and check whether the radio I want to buy is working or not. And if I can't check it physically myself, I can probably rely on the brand as a signal of quality. So I have confidence that I can enter into an exchange and pretty much get what I was expecting to get. But as we've already heard, the transactions that take place in these peer-to-peer markets are essentially anonymous. So buyers and sellers don't know each other. They are unaware of who they're trading with, in the sense that they don't know who the person is. Now, that means that we have that the peer-to-peer markets have a challenge in thinking about how they can ensure that there is sufficient confidence on both sides to enter into an exchange and a trade. And they have to overcome the information asymmetries which exist and which could obviously introduce some sort of market failures. And the way in which they've chosen to do that is through decentralized reputation mechanisms. So the scoring, the feedback, that you use, you have to give feedback on Uber, on Airbnb. I don't think the internship website is yet requiring you to give feedback, but I'm sure that as it becomes more sophisticated, assuming that it does flourish, then we might expect that them to have something along the same lines. But clearly, there is a big question about how reliable this kind of information is and how are consumers using it. There are more sophisticated models that allow firms to make sure that they are getting reliable information, that they are capturing appropriate feedback. But all of the functioning of this market rests very much on the belief that consumers might have as to how reliable that data is. So this brings me on then to our second call for information that we've just completed, which was looking into online reviews and endorsements, so more broadly across the economy, not just looking at peer-to-peer markets, but I think it does have a direct read across, particularly when we're thinking about small startup firms who may be more relying on the use of online reviews and don't necessarily have sophisticated mechanisms to screen and make sure that those are as useful as possible. So what did we find? We found that more than half of adults in the UK are using online reviews and that consumers do appear to trust them. So I think something like 80% of consumers in our survey said that they thought that the feedback that they looked at was genuine and had been of use to them. And we're seeing lots of examples of good practice. We found platforms relying on these mechanisms and responding to the incentives that they have to try and get good outcomes. They're taking steps, thank you, they're taking steps to detect fake reviews and giving most prominence to the most helpful reviews. So there's a lot of time and energy being expended in trying to make these work. And there are good reasons to think that we might expect an equilibrium where these trust mechanisms on peer-to-peer marketplaces do correctly characterise the value of the relevant good, rather than ending up in an equilibrium in which reviews don't convey accurate information. We've already heard about how the platforms really do have an incentive to try and bring that about and make those reviews reliable. But also, I think just the observation of that these marketplaces are everywhere online and they are all using online reviews from consumers gives us some confidence that this is working as we'd expect it to. So it's an encouraging sign just to observe how much this is flourishing already. And consumers genuinely seem willing to give good feedback and to engage in providing honest feedback with suppliers. And likewise, suppliers seem willing to do the same. But there are a couple of reasons why we might be concerned, and I just want to touch on those very briefly. So first of all, any misleading practices, so fake reviews or any harassment that might go on behind the scenes, is obviously clandestine. So consumers don't necessarily know that it's happening and may need to learn from experience. And related to that, some of these are one-off purchases, experience goods essentially, and they may be quite chunky. So if you think about Airbnb, go on holiday, hopefully you go on holiday at least once a year, but you probably don't go and book through Airbnb more than a couple of times a year. So it takes time for consumers to learn how these feedback mechanisms work. And it might be that this takes some time then to feed through into actual consumer behaviour. And there's some really interesting literature that's growing around this, which is looking at some of the strategic reasons for biased feedback. And what I found particularly interesting was an article that's been using eBay's data that I think an economist called Steve Tadalis, who works in the eBay research lab, has done. And he's found that if buyers leave a platform following a bad experience, and if they don't leave feedback, well, then obviously the platform's feedback mechanism is going to be positively biased. And I started thinking about my own experiences, actually, and they did accord with that. I've left a number of these peer-to-peer marketplaces having had a bad experience. And his suggestion is that people probably update their expectations. So if you've had a bad experience early on in your involvement with a peer-to-peer market, that means you're more likely to then leave. However, if you've had longer experience, you may be better able to judge that just one bad experience is not going to be a good prediction of the next engagement transaction that you have on the market. But these do create really quite serious questions for us. And we need to think, the challenge for platforms is how do they deal with these reputational externalities. So as a platform, the essence of what they're trying to achieve is matching. It's an exchange between buyers and sellers. But if they are unable to introduce good, trustworthy mechanisms that allow both sides of the market to identify who they can trade with, then the trade's not going to take place. And if I, as a user of eBay, decide that I've had a bad, poor quality transaction and decide that I'm therefore not going back to eBay at all, then it has an externality that really is important for the way the whole market functions and is a serious concern for eBay and for other platforms as well. And I did a little bit of research to look at how feedback functions. And if you just Google eBay feedback, you will find reams and reams and reams of community boards which are talking about the etiquette of how you should give feedback, the strategic sort of incentives. Do you go first? Do you go second? How do you do it? Should you wait till your parcel's arrived? Do you wait for the money to arrive if you're giving feedback as a seller? What do you do if your buyer has received the package, you've put in all the thank you notes and all the extra presents, but they still didn't leave you feedback? So there's like a blooming community online that's just discussing how this feedback functions. And even with all of that, still only 65% of transactions on eBay have feedback on both sides of them, which is surprising given John and I were having a conversation earlier about how you need to give feedback on these, but it seems like there is still quite a large chunk of the market that aren't giving feedback. And even when they are, it may be that that feedback isn't completely reliable, because I think something like only less than 1% of feedbacks, less than 0.5% of feedback on eBay's website is negative. But there are more than 1% of disputes open at the moment. So it might call into question whether those mechanisms are actually working in the way that they're intended to. So I just wanted to conclude then with some final observations. And I'm sure we'll come on to discuss many of these during the course of the session and this, during the day. So first of all, how can we ensure that consumers maintain trust and continue to share their data? This is obviously fundamental to the functioning of this market. And we need to think about what protections consumers might need in order to ensure that they're comfortable using this data. I think it's quite worrying that some 30% of consumers said that they would not be willing to share their data at all. And if that were to grow, it would obviously have quite serious implications. The next question I just wanted to ask is whether we should be concerned about the impact on competition from the collection of this data. So the market for data, and thinking specifically about peer-to-peer markets, should we be worried about this? Obviously, there's the disruptive innovation from introducing completely new ways of trading, and the impact that that has on incumbents is a force for good, and we need to think about some of the competition issues around that. And then the final question I'll just open up is whether there are circumstances when regulators really should be thinking about intervening. And perhaps the most obvious one on that is when we're thinking about consumer protection laws. And I think overall, my own personal view is that it's fair to say that we need to take care when considering additional regulation. This is a rapidly changing market. Digital markets are clearly a force for good. And to the extent that there are problems, we may well find that those are transient rather than long-lasting, and we may want to take care before intervening and look to the market to try and overcome some of the problems that exist. So thank you very much.